Okay, so just had a request from some students for me to read the extracts from Charles Dickens, like I did with Treasure Island with Robert Louis Stevenson. So I'll get on with doing that. The first one's Nicholas Nickleby, and then we've got David Copperfield. Okay. So, extract 1, and this is a passage describes the conditions. This describes the conditions in a school called Do the Boys Hall. Now, I wasn't sure how to pronounce that because I haven't seen an adaptation of Nicholas Nickleby rather than the book. And obviously, in the book, you can make it up how it sounds. But I've just watched on YouTube a television adaptation, and it's called Do the Boys Hall. Okay, so it was such a crowded scene and there were so many objects to attract attention that at first Nicholas stared about him, really without seeing anything at all. By degrees, however, the place resolved itself into a bare and dirty room with a couple of windows, whereof a 10th part might be of glass, the remainder being stopped up with old copybooks and paper. There were a couple of long old rickety desks, cut and notched, and inked and damaged in every possible way. 2 or 3 forms, a detached desk for Squeers and another for his assistant. The ceiling was supported, like that of a barn, by crossbeams and rafters, and the walls were so stained and discoloured that it was impossible to tell whether they had ever been touched with paint or whitewash. But the pupils, the young noblemen, how the last faint traces of hope, the remotest glimmering of any good to be derived from his efforts in this den, faded from the mind of Nicholas as he looked in dismay around. Pale and haggard faces, lank and bony figures, children with the countenances of old men, deformities with irons upon their limbs, boys of stunted growth, and others whose long, meagre legs could hardly bear their stooping bodies, all crowded on the view together. There were the bleary-eyed, the hare-lipped, the crooked foot, the every ugliness or distortion that told of unnatural aversion conceived by parents for their offspring, or of young lives which, from the earliest dawn of infancy, had been one horrible endurance of cruelty and neglect. There were little faces which should have been handsome, darkened with the scowl of sullen, dogged suffering. There was childhood with the light of its eye quenched, its beauty gone, and its helplessness alone remaining. There were vicious-faced boys, brooding, with leaden eyes like malefactors in a jail. And there were young creatures on whom the sin of their frail parents had descended, weeping even for the mercenary nurse they had known, and lonesome even in their loneliness, with every kindly sympathy and affection blasted in its birth, with every young and healthy feeling flogged and starved down, with every revengeful passion that can fester in swollen hearts, eating its evil way to their core in silence. What an incipient hell was breeding here. Okay, I won't turn it off, I'll just carry on. So, David Copperfield, again by Charles Dickens. I'm just looking at the dates for the thing. So, 1939, Nicholas Nickleby, and 1839, Nicholas Nickleby, and 1850, David Copperfield, so written a bit later on. And here, David Copperfield's describing his teacher, Mr. Creakle. School began in an earnest day. A profound impression was made upon me, I remember, by the roar of voices in the schoolroom suddenly becoming hushed as death when Mr. Creakle entered after breakfast and stood in the doorway looking around upon us like a giant in a storybook surveying his captives. Tungay stood at Mr. Creakle's elbow. He had no occasion, I thought, to cry out, "Silence!" so ferociously, for the boys were all struck speechless and motionless. Mr. Creakle was seen to speak, and Tungay was heard to this effect. "Now, boys, this is a new half. Take care what you're about in this new half. Come fresh up to the lessons, I advise you, for I come fresh up to the punishment. I won't flinch. It will be of no use to your rubbing yourselves. You won't rub the marks out that I shall give you. Now get to work, every boy." When this dreadful exordium was over and Tungay had stumped out again, Mr. Creakle came to where I sat and told me that if I were famous for biting, he was famous for biting too. He then showed me the cane and asked me what I thought of that for a tooth. Was it a sharp tooth, hey? Was it a double tooth, hey? Had it a deep prong, hey? Did it bite, hey? Did it bite? At every question he gave me a fleshy cut with it that made me writhe, so I was very soon made free of Salem House, as Steerforth said, and was very soon in tears also. Not that I mean to say these were special marks of distinction which only I received. On the contrary, a large majority of the boys, especially the smaller ones, were visited with similar instances of notice as Mr. Creakle made the round of the schoolroom. Half the establishment was writhing and crying before the day's work began, and how much of it had writhed and cried before the day's work was over, I am really afraid to recollect, lest I should seem to exaggerate. I should think there never have been a man who enjoyed his profession more than Mr. Creakle did. He had a delight in cutting at the boys, which was like the satisfaction of a craving appetite. I am confident that he couldn't resist a chubby boy especially, that there was a fascination in such a subject which made him restless in his mind until he had scored and marked him for the day. I was chubby myself and ought to know. I am sure when I think of the fellow now, my blood rises against him with the disinterested indignation I should feel if I have known all about him without having ever been in his power. But it rises hotly, because I know him to have been an incapable brute, who had no more right to be possessed of a great trust he held, than to be Lord High Admiral, or Commander-in-Chief, in either of which capacities it is probable that he would have done infinitely less mischief.